In May of 1957, Vito Genovese sent a gunman to shoot Frank Costello in the lobby of his apartment building. Costello survived with a flesh wound and stepped aside. 5 months later, in October, Genovese and Carlo Gambino arranged the murder of Albert Anastasia in a hotel barbershop. Anastasia died in the barber's chair. Gambino took over his family. 3 weeks after that, in November, Genovese called a national summit of mafia bosses at a rural estate in Apalachin, New York, to consolidate his power and formalize his position as the most powerful crime boss in America. State police raided the meeting. Over 60 bosses were arrested fleeing through the woods. The gathering that was supposed to crown Genovese as boss of bosses instead exposed the existence of organized crime to the entire country and made him the man other mobsters blamed for bringing the government's attention to an organization that had survived by staying invisible. Within 2 years, Genovese was in federal prison on a narcotics conviction engineered by the same men who had helped him execute his plan. He would die there 10 years later, having never walked free again. What Genovese built in those 5 months, and what he destroyed in the 5 months that followed, would reshape organized crime in America and end the era when a single boss could rule from the shadows without the government knowing his name. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. If you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to May of 1957, and the man who thought he had found the perfect way to take control of New York's underworld without starting a war. Vito Genovese was born in a village near Naples in November of 1897, the son of a family that would leave Italy when he was 15 and settle on Mulberry Street in the heart of Manhattan's Little Italy. His father was Francis Felice Genovese, a working man. His mother was Nunziata Aluotto. The family immigrated to the United States in 1913 aboard the SS Taormina and took up residence in the neighborhood where the distinction between Italian immigrant life and the Mafia that governed it was not always a distinction anyone bothered to maintain. Vito's education in Italy had gone only to the American equivalent of fifth grade. In New York, his education continued in the streets. He started with petty crimes, stealing merchandise from pushcart vendors, running errands for the mobsters who controlled the neighborhood, collecting money from people who played the illegal lottery. At age 19, in 1917, he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon and spent a year in prison. It was his first conviction in his new country, and it established him as someone willing to take risks that others avoided. During this period, he became close friends with another young man in the neighborhood whose ambitions matched his own. His name was Salvatore Lucania, better known as Charles Lucky Luciano, and the partnership between Genovese and Luciano would define the next 2 decades of organized crime in New York. By the 1920s, Genovese and Luciano were working for Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, who ran one of the most powerful crime families in Manhattan. Prohibition had turned bootlegging into the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history, and Genovese made his reputation during this period not as a businessman but as an enforcer. His value to Masseria was his willingness to use violence, and he used it effectively. In 1930, Masseria allegedly ordered Genovese to murder Gaetano Reina, the leader of a Bronx-based gang who Masseria suspected of betraying him. Genovese carried out the assignment without hesitation. The murder brought him closer to the center of power, but power in the New York underworld in 1930 was about to go through a violent reorganization. Masseria was at war with Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian gangster who had arrived in New York with his own ambitions to control the Italian rackets. The conflict, known as the Castellamarese War, would end with the deaths of both men and the rise of a new generation led by Luciano and Genovese. On April 15th, 1931, Luciano lured Masseria to a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro on Coney Island for what Masseria believed was a friendly card game. While they played cards, Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Gunmen rushed in and shot Masseria to death. The gunmen were Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. Luciano had arranged the murder in a secret deal with Maranzano, who had promised Luciano control of Masseria's operations in exchange for the killing. The deal held for less than 6 months. By September of 1931, Luciano and Genovese had concluded that Maranzano was too ambitious and too dangerous to leave in power. On September 10th, 1931, when Maranzano summoned Luciano, Genovese, and Frank Costello to his office, believing he was going to kill them, they sent a team of gunmen instead. Maranzano was murdered in his Manhattan office. With both old world bosses dead, Luciano reorganized the New York underworld into what became the Five Families, created the commission as a governing body to settle disputes, and named Vito Genovese as his underboss in what was now called the Luciano Crime Family. Genovese had killed his way to the second highest position in one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country, and for the next 5 years he operated as Luciano's most trusted lieutenant. In June of 1936, Lucky Luciano was convicted on pandering charges and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in state prison. With Luciano imprisoned, Genovese became acting boss of the family. He held the position for less than a year. In January of 1937, facing prosecution for the 1934 murder of Ferdinand Boccia, an associate he had killed over a rigged card game, Genovese fled to Italy with $750,000 in cash. He settled near Naples and proceeded to align himself with the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini. He bribed party members, became friends with Mussolini's son-in-law Galeazzo Ciano, and allegedly supplied Ciano with cocaine. By the end of World War II, Genovese had donated approximately $4 million to the fascist party and had been awarded the Order of Saints Maurice and Lazarus. When the Allied forces invaded Italy in 1943, Genovese switched sides, began working as an interpreter for the United States Army, and positioned himself to return to America once the war ended. He came back in 1945. The murder charge that had driven him into exile was dismissed in June of 1946 after the key witness, Peter La Tempa, was poisoned while in protective custody. Genovese returned to New York, expecting to resume his position as a leader of the Luciano family. What he found instead was that Frank Costello, who had been acting boss since Genovese's flight in 1937, had consolidated power and had no intention of stepping aside. Luciano had been deported to Italy in 1946 as part of a deal related to his wartime assistance, and Costello was now running the family with the full support of its members and the respect of the other New York bosses. Costello was not the same kind of leader that Genovese had been under Luciano. Costello was a political operator, a fixer, a man who controlled judges and politicians, and who believed that power came from influence rather than violence. He was known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and his approach to organized crime was fundamentally different from the brutal enforcement methods that Genovese represented. When Genovese returned, Costello demoted him from underboss to capo regime, giving him control of only the Greenwich Village crew. For the next decade, Genovese watched Costello operate as the boss of the family that Genovese believed should have been his, and the resentment built with every year that passed. By early 1957, Genovese had concluded that Costello would never voluntarily step aside, and that removing him by force would start a war with Costello's powerful allies, including Albert Anastasia and the network that Lucky Luciano still controlled from exile in Italy. Genovese needed a solution that would accomplish his goal without triggering a conflict that could destroy him, and he found it in a young enforcer named Vincent Gigante, who had fought as a professional boxer and who owed Genovese a debt that could not be repaid in money. Vincent Gigante had been Genovese's bodyguard and chauffeur for years, and Genovese had helped pay for Gigante's mother's surgery, which in the culture that governed such relationships meant that when Genovese gave Gigante an assignment, there was no possibility of refusal. Gigante had boxed professionally as a light heavyweight between 1944 and 1947, compiling a record of 20 wins and 4 losses in 25 matches. He had fought at Madison Square Garden and St. Nicholas Arena. He had the physical presence and the willingness to follow orders that made him useful to Genovese in ways that extended beyond the boxing ring. In early 1957, Genovese gave Gigante the assignment that would define the first chapter of his criminal reputation. He told Gigante to kill Frank Costello. On the evening of May 2nd, 1957, Frank Costello returned to his apartment building at 115 Central Park West after having dinner with his wife and friends. He had left the dinner early because he had business to attend to. A black Cadillac pulled up behind the taxi that had brought Costello home. Vincent Gigante stepped out of the Cadillac and followed Costello into the lobby of the building. What happened next was witnessed by the building's doorman and would be reconstructed in court the following year. As Costello entered the lobby, Gigante allegedly shouted, "This is for you, Frank." Costello turned his head at the sound of his name. Gigante fired a single shot from a .38 caliber handgun. The bullet, which would have struck Costello directly in the head if he had not turned, instead grazed his skull, curving from his right ear around to his neck. Costello dropped to a leather couch in the lobby, bleeding. Gigante fled to the waiting Cadillac and drove away. Costello was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital. Doctors examined the wound and confirmed it was superficial. The bullet had not penetrated the skull. Costello would survive. Police arrived and searched him. In his pocket, they found a slip of paper with a handwritten note that read, "Gross casino win as of April 27th, 57, $651,284. The note revealed what federal investigators had not previously known. Frank Costello had a hidden financial interest in the Tropicana Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, which had opened just weeks earlier. The discovery would trigger a major investigation into organized crime's involvement in the Las Vegas casino industry, producing legal and political consequences that extended far beyond what Genovese had intended when he ordered the hit. The building doorman provided police with a description of the shooter: stocky build, approximately 6 feet tall. Police arrested Vincent Gigante. Gigante went to trial in 1958. Frank Costello took the stand and testified that he could not identify his attacker and had not heard a shot fired. The jury acquitted Gigante. The outcome was exactly what Genovese had designed the operation to produce. Costello had survived, which meant his allies could not retaliate for a murder. But the message had been delivered with absolute clarity. The wound was sufficient. Costello announced his retirement from the position of boss and ceded control of the Luciano family to Vito Genovese. The family that Lucky Luciano had built and Frank Costello had run for 2 decades was now in the hands of the man who had spent a decade resenting his exclusion from it. Genovese controlled what would now be called the Genovese Crime Family. But there was still the problem of Albert Anastasia, and Anastasia was not a man who would step aside for anyone. Albert Anastasia had more names than most men carried in a lifetime, and every one of them was a warning. He was called the Mad Hatter, the Lord High Executioner, the Earthquake, the One-Man Army. He had been born Umberto Anastasio in Tropea, Calabria, Italy, on September 26, 1902, and had come to the United States as a young man. By the 1920s, he had become one of the most feared enforcers in the New York underworld. He was a co-founder of Murder Incorporated, the kill-for-hire operation that worked for Lucky Luciano and other bosses during the Prohibition era and the years that followed. Estimates of the number of contract killings that Murder Incorporated carried out vary widely, but the organization is believed to have been responsible for somewhere between 400 and 1,000 murders between 1921 and 1941. Anastasia personally participated in many of those killings, including the April 15, 1931 murder of Joe Masseria, where he had been one of the 4 gunmen alongside Genovese, Adonis, and Siegel. During World War II, Anastasia joined the United States Army and helped engineer the deal that eventually allowed Lucky Luciano to be released from prison and deported to Italy in exchange for using his influence to keep the New York City docks free of Nazi infiltration. Anastasia received United States citizenship in 1943 for his military service and was honorably discharged from the army in 1944. After the war, he returned to organized crime and served as underboss of the Mangano crime family under Vincent Mangano. The relationship between Anastasia and Mangano deteriorated over the years, and on April 19th, 1951, Vincent Mangano disappeared. His body was never found. On the same day, his brother Philip Mangano was found shot to death. Anastasia was widely believed to have ordered both killings, though he was never charged. He claimed self-defense to the commission members who questioned him about the disappearances. With Vincent Mangano gone, Anastasia became the boss of what was now the Anastasia crime family, with the support of Frank Costello, who persuaded the commission to allow the transition. Anastasia's alliance with Costello was strong, and when Costello helped Anastasia take control of the Mangano family, Costello gained a powerful ally in his ongoing rivalry with Vito Genovese. But by the mid-1950s, Anastasia had made a series of decisions that created new enemies and weakened his position. In 1952, he ordered the murder of Arnold Schuster, a civilian who had helped police capture bank robber Willie Sutton. Anastasia killed Schuster because he did not like the fact that Schuster had cooperated with law enforcement. The murder violated a fundamental Mafia rule against killing outsiders and brought unnecessary public scrutiny to organized crime. The commission was horrified, but Costello and Luciano needed Anastasia in their power struggle against Genovese, so no action was taken. In 1955, Anastasia pleaded guilty to tax evasion for underreporting his income during the late 1940s. He was sentenced on June 3, 1955 to 1 year in federal prison and a $20,000 fine. While Anastasia was in prison, the federal government attempted to have him deported, but a higher court overturned the deportation order. During this same period, Anastasia made another strategic error. He attempted to move into the Cuban casino operations that were controlled by Meyer Lansky, one of the most powerful Jewish mobsters in American history. Lansky was angered by the encroachment, and his support, which Anastasia had previously enjoyed, began to erode. In June of 1957, Frank Scalise, Anastasia's underboss, and the man identified as directly responsible for selling memberships in the Gambino family to unqualified candidates, was murdered. According to later testimony, Anastasia approved the hit himself and subsequently approved the murder of Scalise's brother Joseph when Joseph threatened to avenge Frank's death. To replace Scalise as underboss, Anastasia promoted Carlo Gambino, a captain in the family who was intelligent, ambitious, and calculating. Gambino had been quietly building his own power base within the organization for years. What Anastasia did not know was that Vito Genovese had already approached Gambino with a proposal. Genovese offered Gambino control of the Anastasia family if Gambino would help Genovese remove Anastasia from power. Gambino understood that an outright war with Anastasia would be costly and uncertain. He agreed to Genovese's plan. Meyer Lansky, angry about the Cuban casino issue, joined the conspiracy. The layers of protection that had kept Anastasia safe for decades were being peeled away, and the former head of Murder Incorporated was about to discover that the organization he had once used to kill others could be turned against him with the same efficiency. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia entered the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel at 877th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan for what he believed would be an ordinary shave and haircut. The barbershop, owned by Arthur Grasso, had a dozen barber chairs. Anastasia sat down in the fourth chair. His barber, Joseph Bocchino, began preparing him for a shave. Anastasia's driver and bodyguard, Anthony Coppola, parked the car in the underground garage of the hotel and then took a walk outside, leaving Anastasia unprotected in the barber shop. The reason for Coppola's absence has never been definitively established, but the timing was not accidental. Anastasia settled into the barber's chair. Bocchino placed hot towels over his face. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, two men with scarves covering their faces and gloves on their hands rushed into the barber shop. They shoved Bocchino out of the way and opened fire on Anastasia with a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver and a .38 caliber handgun. Anastasia, hearing the shots and feeling the impact, lunged from the chair. In the chaos and confusion, he became disoriented by the mirrors that lined the barbershop walls. He tried to attack the reflections of the gunmen in the mirror rather than the gunmen themselves. The attackers continued firing. 5 bullets struck Anastasia. 2 of the wounds were fatal. 1 bullet struck him in the head. Another penetrated his lung, kidney, and spleen. He was also hit in the back, hip, and hand. Anastasia fell to the barbershop floor and died. The gunmen fled from the hotel. 14 people witnessed the murder. The New York Police Department assigned 100 detectives to the case. The day after the murder, police recovered one of the guns in a litter basket near the Park Sheraton Hotel. Despite the number of witnesses and the scale of the investigation, the crime was never officially solved. No one was ever charged with the murder. The suspected shooters, according to various accounts that emerged over the years, included Joe Gallo, known as Crazy Joe, who allegedly led a hit team and later boasted to an associate, "You can just call the 5 of us the barbershop quintet." Other sources identified Stephen Armone and Stephen Gramada as members of the crew that carried out the killing. The consensus among investigators and organized crime historians was that Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino had ordered the hit, and that Gambino had given the contract either to Joe Profaci, who then assigned it to the Gallo crew, or directly to members of his own organization. The Park Sheraton Hotel had been the site of another famous mob, killing nearly 3 decades earlier. Arnold Rothstein, known as the Brain, had been shot and killed there in November of 1928. The barbershop where Anastasia died would later be converted into a Starbucks. Albert Anastasia's funeral was conducted at a Brooklyn funeral home. The Diocese of Brooklyn refused to sanction a church burial. He was interred at Greenwood Cemetery in Greenwood Heights, Brooklyn, with only a handful of friends and relatives in attendance. The grave marker reads, Anastasio, the original family name. In 1958, less than a year after Anastasia's death, his widow and children emigrated to Canada and changed the family name from Anastasio to Anicio. The barber chair in which Anastasia had been sitting when he was killed was later auctioned for $7,000 and eventually became an exhibit at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. Carlo Gambino immediately took control of what had been the Anastasia crime family and renamed it the Gambino crime family. He appointed Joseph Biondo as his underboss. Vito Genovese now controlled the Genovese family, and his ally Carlo Gambino controlled the Gambino family. In the span of 5 months, Genovese had removed Frank Costello from power and had overseen the elimination of Albert Anastasia. What Genovese wanted next was formal recognition of what he had accomplished, and he decided the way to achieve that recognition was to call a national meeting of Mafia bosses. Immediately after the Anastasia murder, with Frank Costello retired and Carlo Gambino running what had been the Anastasia family, Vito Genovese wanted to legitimize his new power by holding a national Cosa Nostra meeting, and he selected Stefano Magaddino, the boss of Buffalo and a commission member, to organize it. The meeting had reportedly been planned initially for Chicago, but Magaddino urged that it be held instead at a more isolated rural location where surveillance by law enforcement would be less likely. Magaddino chose Joseph Barbara, a crime boss in northeastern Pennsylvania, and Barbara's underboss, Russell Bufalino, to handle all the arrangements. Barbara owned a large estate at 625 McFall Road in the town of Apalachin, New York, a property of approximately 53 to 58 acres located along the south shore of the Susquehanna River, about 200 miles northwest of New York City. Barbara was supposedly a legitimate businessman, and his estate seemed like a secure location for a gathering of the country's most powerful mobsters. The meeting was scheduled for November 14th, 1957. An estimated 100 mafiosi from the United States, Italy, and Cuba were invited to attend. The attendees would include representatives from all 5 of the New York crime families, along with bosses and high-ranking members from crime families in Buffalo, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Tampa, New Orleans, and other cities across the country. International representatives from Italy and Cuba were also expected. The agenda for the meeting included multiple items of significant importance to organized crime. Genovese intended to have himself recognized as the effective leader of the American Mafia. Carlo Gambino was to be formally proclaimed as the boss of the family that had belonged to Anastasia. The group would discuss how to divide Anastasia's operations and criminal interests. They would address the recent murders of Anastasia and Frank Scalise. There were matters related to Cuban gambling operations and narcotics smuggling that needed coordination among the families. The international narcotics trade was an important topic, as were the New York garment industry rackets, including loan sharking to business owners and control of garment center trucking. The Boggs-Daniel Act, which imposed stricter federal penalties on heroin importation, had recently been passed, and the implications needed to be discussed. The day before the meeting, Joseph Barbara went into town and ordered large quantities of expensive cuts of steak to feed his expected guests. The estate had been used for a similar mafia gathering in 1956, and after that meeting, a mobster named Carmine Galante had been stopped by state troopers while leaving the area. A local state trooper named Edgar Croswell had become aware of that incident and had been keeping Barbara's property under occasional surveillance ever since. On the morning of November 14th, 1957, expensive cars with license plates from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, California, and other states began arriving in the small rural town of Appalachin. The cars were Cadillacs, Lincolns, Chryslers, the kind of vehicles that stood out dramatically in a quiet area where most residents drove far more modest automobiles. Croswell noticed the unusual concentration of luxury vehicles and began writing down license plate numbers. When he checked the registrations, he discovered that many of the cars were registered to individuals with known criminal records. Approximately 100 men gathered at the Barbara estate that morning, believing they were about to participate in a historic summit that would establish the power structure of organized crime for years to come. Vito Genovese was hours away from the formal recognition he had spent 30 years building toward, but Edgar Croswell was outside the estate with reinforcements, and the meeting that was supposed to crown Genovese as boss of bosses was about to become the most catastrophic exposure of organized crime in American history. Edgar Croswell saw the Cadillacs first, dozens of them, gleaming black luxury cars with license plates from across the country, parked along the only paved stretch of road leading to Joseph Barbara's estate, and he knew immediately that something significant was happening. Croswell and his partner checked the license plates and discovered that many were registered to known criminals. Croswell called for state police reinforcements. When the backup units arrived, they began setting up a roadblock on the roads surrounding the Barbara property. Bartolo Guccia, an employee of Joseph Barbara who had left the estate to check on a fish order, spotted the police roadblock and the gathering officers. He returned to the estate and reported what he had seen. Word of the police presence spread rapidly through the meeting. Panic erupted among the assembled mobsters. Some of the men attempted to leave by car, but they were stopped at the roadblock. Others abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot through the fields and woods that surrounded the estate. The scene that unfolded over the next hour was chaotic. Men in expensive silk suits and polished shoes ran through mud and brush. Some jumped into ditches, others hid in the woods. A few reportedly jumped into rivers to avoid capture. The suits that had been carefully chosen for a formal gathering were ruined by the scramble through the countryside. Up to 50 men managed to escape the area before police could apprehend them, but over 60 men, with estimates ranging from 58 to 62 depending on the source, were caught and detained by state police. Among those apprehended were some of the most powerful figures in American organized crime. Vito Genovese was stopped in a car at one of the roadblocks. Carlo Gambino was arrested. Joseph Profaci was taken into custody. Joseph Bonanno, another commission member, was caught. In total, representatives from 21 different crime families were detained and questioned by police. The cover story that the arrested men offered was remarkably consistent and remarkably unconvincing. Virtually all of them claimed that they had heard Joseph Barbara was feeling ill and that they had come to Appalachin to visit him and wish him well. Some suggested it had been a social gathering or a barbecue. The explanations were not legally sufficient to charge anyone with a crime, since attending a meeting was not itself illegal, but the exposure was devastating. The meeting that Genovese had organized to consolidate his power had barely begun when the raid occurred. Almost none of the agenda items had been addressed. Gambino was not formally proclaimed boss. Genovese was not recognized as the leader of the Mafia. The divisions of Anastasia's territories were not settled. Instead, the men who controlled organized crime in America were sitting in police custody, their names being recorded, their associations being documented, and their presence at the same location on the same day becoming a matter of official record. The next morning, newspapers across the country carried the story of what had happened in a rural New York town that most Americans had never heard of, and the words Mafia and organized crime and national conspiracy appeared in headlines that would force the federal government to acknowledge what it had spent decades denying. The raid at Appalachin was the first major public confirmation that a nationwide criminal organization existed. For years, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had insisted that there was no such thing as a mafia, no coordinated criminal syndicate operating across state lines. The arrests at Appalachin made that position impossible to maintain. The men who had been caught fleeing through the woods represented families from New York to California, from Florida to the Midwest. They had clearly gathered for a purpose that went beyond visiting a sick friend. The arrested men were released within days because being present at a meeting was not a prosecutable offense. However, federal prosecutors eventually charged 20 of the Appalachian attendees with conspiring to obstruct justice by lying about the nature of the gathering. In January of 1959, all 20 were convicted. They were fined up to $10,000 each and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 3 to 5 years. Every one of those convictions was overturned on appeal in 1960. Legally, no one served time specifically for attending the Appalachian meeting, but the damage to organized crime had already been done, and the damage was not legal. It was structural and institutional. 4 days after the raid, on November 18th, 1957, J. Edgar Hoover issued a directive ordering the creation of an anti-mob initiative within the FBI. Shortly thereafter, he created the Top Hoodlum program, which was designed to systematically investigate organized crime across the country. He authorized the use of wiretaps, some of them illegal, to gather intelligence on Mafia activities. Hoover would later admit that he had believed for 30 years that the Mafia did not exist, and that the Appalachian raid was the first evidence that changed his mind. He framed the new investigations using the language and concepts of the Cold War, emphasizing front organizations, aliases, underground cells, and the need for citizens to inform on their neighbors. The shift in FBI priorities was immediate and far-reaching. Congressional action followed quickly. Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who was already involved in anti-corruption efforts, used the Appalachian meeting as evidence of a national criminal conspiracy in hearings before the McClellan Committee. Over the following years, hundreds of hours of testimony before the committee exposed the extent of organized crime's infiltration into labor unions, legitimate businesses, and political structures. Robert Kennedy became convinced that his aggressive pursuit of the Mafia was the reason his brother President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Whether that belief was correct or not, the political and law enforcement response to Appalachin fundamentally changed the relationship between the government and organized crime. The investigations that began in November of 1957 would eventually lead to the passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, in 1970. That legislation would provide prosecutors with the tools to dismantle the Mafia families in the 1980s and 1990s. Joseph Barbara, the host of the meeting, faced immediate and severe consequences. He was investigated and indicted for refusing to testify before a grand jury about what had transpired at his home on November 14th. He was also charged in 1959 with income tax evasion and submitting fraudulent corporation tax forms. He lost his liquor license. He lost his contract with Canada Dry. He avoided testifying for 2 years by citing poor health, but he eventually appeared before a state Supreme Court commission. He died in 1959, just 2 years after the raid, his health destroyed and his legitimate business operations ruined. Stefano Magaddino, the Buffalo boss who had organized the meeting at Genovese's request, became a target of retaliation. Genovese and Sam Giancana, the Chicago boss, blamed Magaddino for the disaster. At some point after the publicity and law enforcement attention subsided, someone tossed a grenade through the window of Magaddino's home on Dana Drive in the Buffalo suburb of Lewiston. The grenade failed to detonate. Magaddino survived. The other Mafia bosses blamed Vito Genovese for calling the meeting in the first place. The gathering that was supposed to legitimize Genovese's power had instead exposed the Mafia to America, forced the FBI to acknowledge its existence, created a permanent record of which families existed and who ran them, and triggered investigations that would continue for decades. Genovese had achieved his tactical objectives. Costello was out. Anastasia was dead. Gambino controlled the Gambino family. Genovese controlled the Genovese family. But the strategic disaster of Apalachin overshadowed everything else, and the consequences for Genovese, personally, were only beginning. While Vito Genovese was dealing with the public disaster of Appalachin and the blame from other bosses, 4 men who had their own reasons to want him removed were quietly assembling what they believed would be the case that would put him in prison for the rest of his life. The 4 men were Lucky Luciano, who was living in exile in Naples, Italy; Frank Costello, who had retired from active leadership but remained influential; Meyer Lansky, the powerful Jewish mobster who controlled significant gambling operations in Cuba; and Carlo Gambino, the new boss of the Gambino family. Each man had a distinct motivation for wanting Genovese destroyed. Luciano believed that Genovese's reckless involvement in narcotics trafficking would bring down the organizational structures that Luciano had spent his career building. Costello wanted revenge for the assassination attempt that had left him with a scar and forced his retirement. Lansky opposed the kind of reckless drug operations that invited federal scrutiny and destabilized the more profitable gambling enterprises. Gambino wanted Genovese removed so that Gambino himself could control the commission without interference from a man who believed he should be boss of bosses. The plan they developed was straightforward. They would bribe a drug dealer to testify that Vito Genovese had personally met with him to discuss narcotics operations, and they would use that testimony to secure a federal conviction on narcotics conspiracy charges. The witness they selected was a Puerto Rican drug dealer named Nelson Silva Cantelops. An agent for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics named Anthony Consoli had learned about Cantelops from an informant who described him as a small-time dealer with connections to larger narcotics networks. Consoli tracked Cantelops down and found him in the Tombs, the large city jail in Lower Manhattan at the corner of Center and Franklin Streets, where he was being held on narcotics possession charges. Cantelops was in his early 30s, short and chubby with bulging eyes set in a sallow face. He had an arrest record in New Jersey dating back to 1949, when he had been convicted of obtaining money under false pretenses and had served 3 years in Trenton State Prison. According to accounts that emerged later, an intermediary approached Cantelops, possibly while he was in Sing Sing prison, with an offer. He would be paid $100,000 to testify that he had personally attended a meeting with Vito Genovese, at which Genovese had discussed taking over the entire drug trade in the Bronx. The money was allegedly provided by Luciano, Costello, and Lansky, with Carlo Gambino contributing $25,000 to the total. There was an additional requirement built into the deal. Cantelops was instructed to implicate Vincent Gigante as well, so that Gigante would serve time as punishment for his botched attempt to kill Costello. Jimmy Allo, known as Blue Eyes, a senior member of the Genovese family, allegedly arranged for an intermediary to present the offer to Cantelops. To make Cantelops credible as a witness, the conspirators fed him detailed insider information about Genovese's operations, names of associates, dates of transactions, and other intelligence that Cantelops could not have known on his own. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics spent a full year screening Cantelops and validating his story before bringing the case to a grand jury. The fact that a small-time drug pusher was claiming to have had direct access to one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America was inherently implausible. In normal circumstances, a man at Genovese's level would never personally meet with a street-level dealer. The testimony would be hearsay at best, but federal prosecutors wanted Genovese badly enough to overlook the credibility issues. The FBN built a larger case around Cantelops' testimony, targeting not just Genovese, but an entire narcotics network that included Vincent Gigante, John Armento, Carmine Galante, and more than a dozen other defendants. On July 7, 1958, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics arrested Vito Genovese and 53 other defendants on charges of conspiring to import, conceal, and sell heroin. Of that group, only Genovese and 16 others were actually indicted. Two defendants, Carmine Galante and John Armento, evaded arrest initially and were not present when the trial began. Vincent Gigante was among those indicted. He was arrested just 4 weeks after his acquittal in the Frank Costello shooting case. The timing was not coincidental. The deal that had allegedly been offered to Cantelops specifically required that Gigante be included in the charges. For Vito Genovese, the indictment represented the convergence of forces that he had spent decades trying to control. The government wanted him. His former allies wanted him removed. And a witness who may or may not have been telling the truth was prepared to testify that Genovese had personally directed a heroin conspiracy. On January 5th, 1959, Vito Genovese and 14 co-defendants went on trial in federal court, and the government's case rested almost entirely on the testimony of a man that many observers believed had been paid to lie. The trial took place in New York. The defendants faced charges of conspiracy to import and smuggle narcotics into the United States, conspiracy to import and conceal narcotics, and conspiracy to sell heroin. The star witness for the prosecution was Nelson Cantelops. He took the stand and testified that he had personally attended a meeting with Vito Genovese. According to Cantelops, Genovese had discussed plans to take over the entire drug trade in the Bronx during that meeting. Cantelops provided details about dates, locations, and the names of other individuals who had allegedly been present or involved in the conspiracy. The credibility issues with Cantelops' testimony were significant and were noted by multiple observers at the time. Court watchers, defense attorneys, and organized crime experts pointed out that it was highly unlikely that a major mafia boss would personally meet with a low-level drug dealer. There was no physical evidence that the meeting Cantelops described had ever taken place. The testimony was largely hearsay, consisting of Cantelops recounting conversations and plans that he claimed to have witnessed. Cantelops had an extensive criminal background, which the defense highlighted during cross-examination. Despite these issues, federal prosecutors presented Cantelops as a credible witness and supported his account with additional evidence of an international narcotics network that involved known Genovese associates. The defense argued that Cantelops was lying, that the story was implausible, and that the government had failed to produce any corroborating physical evidence of the alleged meeting between Genovese and the witness. Genovese's attorneys pointed out the inherent absurdity of believing that one of the most powerful organized crime figures in the country would expose himself to a street-level dealer in the manner Cantelops described. But the government had built a case that extended beyond Cantelops' testimony alone. They presented evidence of heroin shipments, financial transactions, and communications among members of the alleged conspiracy. The jury heard testimony about the broader narcotics operation and the roles that various defendants had allegedly played in it. After deliberations, the jury returned a verdict. On April 4th, 1959, Vito Genovese was convicted on charges of conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws. The other defendants were also convicted. Sentencing took place on April 17th, 1959. Before the judge pronounced sentence, Genovese was given an opportunity to make a statement. He stood and said, "All I can say, Your Honor, is I am innocent." The judge sentenced Genovese to 15 years in federal prison and imposed a fine of $20,000. Genovese was 61 years old. His bail was immediately revoked, and he was taken into custody. Genovese filed appeals that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. He hired Edward Bennett Williams, one of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in the country, to handle the appeals. In October of 1963, Williams appeared before the Court of Appeals to argue that the conviction should be overturned. The court rejected the appeal. Every subsequent appeal was also denied. Genovese was sent first to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and later transferred to Leavenworth. From prison, he attempted to continue running the Genovese crime family. He established a ruling panel of high-level family members to handle day-to-day operations. Anthony Strollo served as underboss. Gerardo Catena and others acted as front bosses, taking orders from Genovese and presenting themselves as the public faces of the organization, while Genovese directed operations from his cell. The other defendants in the narcotics case faced their own consequences. John Ormento, who had initially evaded arrest, was eventually captured. He died in prison in 1974. Carmine Gigante was also caught and convicted. He served 12 years and was released in early 1974. Vincent Gigante served 5 years of a 7-year sentence and was paroled. When he was released, he was promoted to captain of the Greenwich Village crew, the same position his mentor Genovese had held decades earlier. Gigante would eventually rise to become boss of the Genovese family in 1981 and would run the organization for more than 2 decades, using many of the same techniques of secrecy and misdirection that Genovese had employed. For Vito Genovese, there would be no release. His health deteriorated during his imprisonment. On February 14th, 1969, Valentine's Day, Genovese suffered a heart attack at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He died at the age of 71, having served approximately 10 years of his 15-year sentence. He never walked free again. The man who had spent 5 months in 1957 removing 2 rivals and positioning himself to become boss of bosses spent the last 10 years of his life in federal custody because he could not resist calling a meeting to formalize what he had already won. While Vito Genovese was running his family from a federal prison cell, the men who had conspired against him and the men who had benefited from his plan were building the structures that would dominate organized crime for the next 2 decades. Carlo Gambino became the most powerful figure in the American Mafia after Genovese's imprisonment. Gambino took control of the commission and effectively became the boss of bosses, though he never used that title publicly and never made the kind of formal announcement that Genovese had planned at Appalachin. Gambino's approach to leadership was the opposite of Genovese's. He maintained a low profile. He avoided publicity. He understood that invisibility was protection, and he operated with a level of strategic discipline that allowed him to hold power until his death from a heart attack on October 15th, 1976, at the age of 73. Under Gambino's leadership, the Gambino crime family became the wealthiest and most powerful of the 5 families, and Gambino died a free man, having never served significant prison time despite decades at the highest levels of organized crime. Frank Costello lived out his retirement in relative peace. He maintained his gambling operations around the United States, including interests in Las Vegas. He remained a respected figure within the Mafia, and other bosses consulted him for advice even after he had formally stepped away from active leadership. His United States citizenship was stripped from him in 1961, but he continued to live in New York. He died of natural causes on February 18th, 1973, at the age of 82. Lucky Luciano remained in Italy until his death. He continued to exert influence over American organized crime operations from exile, maintaining contact with associates and providing guidance on major decisions. He died in Italy in 1962. Meyer Lansky continued to operate his gambling empire until the Castro Revolution in Cuba forced him to shift his operations elsewhere. He remained one of the most powerful figures in organized crime until his death from natural causes. Vincent Gigante was paroled after serving 5 years of his 7-year narcotics sentence. He returned to the Genovese family and was promoted to captain. taking over the Greenwich Village crew. In 1981, he became the boss of the Genovese crime family. He would run the family for more than 2 decades, using an elaborate performance of mental illness to avoid prosecution, wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, while running a criminal organization that generated an estimated $100 million a year. The techniques of secrecy and misdirection that Genovese had valued were perfected by his protege. Despite Vito Genovese's downfall, the Genovese crime family survived and remained the largest, most powerful, and most secretive of the 5 families. The ruling panel system and the use of front bosses that Genovese had created from prison became permanent features of the organization. After Genovese's death, a succession of acting bosses and front bosses ran the family while real power remained diffused and hidden. Anthony Strollo, Gerardo Catena, and Thomas Eboli all served in leadership roles at various times. Catena was indicted and jailed in 1970. Eboli became front boss from 1970 to 1972. The Gambino family that Carlo Gambino built remained powerful for decades after his death. Paul Castellano, Gambino's brother-in-law, succeeded him as boss. Castellano was murdered in 1985 on the orders of John Gotti, who then took over the family. Gotti represented a philosophy of leadership that was the complete opposite of what Gambino and Genovese had practiced. Gotti sought maximum visibility. He courted media attention. He held meetings in public. He became the most famous mob boss in America, and his approach destroyed the family that Gambino had built. Gotti was convicted and died in prison. The long-term impact of the Appalachin raid extended far beyond the immediate arrests and the embarrassment it caused. The top hoodlum program that J. Edgar Hoover created in response to Appalachin evolved into systematic FBI investigations of organized crime across the country. Those investigations produced intelligence that was used to develop the legal framework for the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which was passed in 1970. RICO gave prosecutors the tools to charge entire criminal organizations rather than individual criminals. In the 1980s and 1990s, RICO prosecutions devastated the Mafia families. Bosses, underbosses, and entire leadership structures were convicted and imprisoned. The power that organized crime had held over labor unions, legitimate businesses, and political structures was systematically dismantled. Robert F. Kennedy's anti-mob crusade, which was fueled in part by the evidence of a national conspiracy that Apalachin provided, continued when he became Attorney General under his brother President John F. Kennedy. The McClellan Committee hearings and the subsequent investigations created a public record of Mafia activities that had never existed before. The era when the Mafia could operate in the shadows, when the FBI could deny its existence, when bosses could control entire industries without the government interfering, ended in November of 1957 on a rural estate in upstate New York. The concept of a boss of bosses, a single figure who could command the entire American Mafia, died with Vito Genovese's attempt to claim that title. After Genovese, the commission operated as a more collective body. No single boss ever again had the combination of power, reach, and control that Genovese had briefly possessed in the months between Costello's retirement and the Appalachin disaster. Carlo Gambino came closest, but even Gambino understood that the title itself was dangerous and that claiming it publicly would make him a target. The lesson of Appalachin was clear to everyone who survived it. Visibility was death. Recognition was prosecution. The organization that stayed invisible could survive. The boss who announced his power destroyed it. The 5 months from May to November of 1957 had reshaped organized crime in America, removed 2 bosses, elevated another, exposed the Mafia's existence to the country, forced the FBI to acknowledge what it had denied, and sent the man who orchestrated it all to a prison cell he would never leave, which by any measure except the one that mattered to Vito Genovese, made the entire operation simultaneously a perfect success and a complete disaster. What Genovese executed in those 5 months was tactically brilliant. The Costello shooting removed an obstacle without starting a war. The message was delivered, Costello stepped aside, and Genovese took control of the family without bloodshed beyond a superficial wound. The Anastasia murder removed the second obstacle with the help of Carlo Gambino, who gained his own family in the process. The succession was smooth. The power was consolidated. Genovese controlled the Genovese family. Gambino controlled the Gambino family. The alliance between them appeared solid. Every tactical objective had been accomplished exactly as planned, but Genovese could not accept success without recognition. He needed the title. He needed the other bosses to acknowledge formally what he had already achieved through force and cunning. He needed to be proclaimed boss of bosses in front of the men who ran organized crime across the country. That psychological need, that requirement for formal validation, led him to call the Apalachin meeting. The meeting itself was unnecessary. Genovese already controlled what he had set out to control. Costello was gone. Anastasia was dead. Gambino was in his debt. The other families understood the new power structure without needing a summit to formalize it. But Genovese wanted the ceremony. He wanted the gathering. He wanted to sit at the head of a table with 100 mobsters and receive their acknowledgement of his supremacy. The decision to call that meeting revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the environment in which he was operating. Organized crime had survived for decades by staying invisible. The most successful bosses were the ones that law enforcement did not know about, the ones who operated through intermediaries and frontmen, the ones who never appeared in photographs or public records. Genovese understood this intellectually. He had spent years building systems of secrecy and insulation, but he could not resist the temptation to gather the entire leadership of the Mafia in one place at one time to formalize his position. The Appalachin raid destroyed everything he had built. The meeting that was supposed to legitimize his power instead exposed the organization to the government. The FBI, which had spent decades denying that the Mafia existed, was forced to acknowledge its existence and begin systematic investigations. The bosses who had been caught fleeing through the woods blamed Genovese for the disaster. The publicity in the investigations that followed made it impossible for organized crime to operate the way it had before. And within 2 years of Appalachin, Genovese's former allies had conspired to have him convicted on narcotics charges and sent to prison for the rest of his life. Whether the conviction was legitimate or whether it was a frame-up constructed with bribed testimony remains a matter of debate among historians. What is not debatable is that Genovese went to prison and died there. The man who had removed 2 bosses in 5 months spent 10 years in federal custody and never walked free again. What survived Genovese was the family that bore his name. The Genovese crime family remained the strongest, most secretive, and most disciplined of the 5 families for decades after his death. The techniques of secrecy that he had valued, the use of front bosses to shield the real leadership, the insistence on operational security, and the avoidance of electronic surveillance became permanent features of the organization. Vincent Gigante, who had been Genovese's protege and who had carried out the Costello shooting, eventually became boss and ran the family using an elaborate performance of insanity that protected him from prosecution for nearly 30 years. The methods worked. The family survived. What did not survive was Genovese himself. Carlo Gambino, who had helped execute Genovese's plan and who had then helped destroy him, understood what Genovese had not. Gambino became the effective boss of bosses without ever claiming the title. He operated invisibly. He avoided publicity. He died free at the age of 73, having controlled the commission and the largest criminal organization in New York for 2 decades. Genovese died in prison at 71, having controlled nothing for the last 10 years of his life, except the bitterness of understanding that he had destroyed himself. The final assessment of Vito Genovese's plan requires holding 2 contradictory truths simultaneously. He executed the most ambitious power grab in American Mafia history. He succeeded at every tactical objective. He removed two powerful rivals without starting a war that would have destroyed him. He positioned himself to control the most powerful criminal organization in the country. And he lost everything because he needed recognition more than he needed success. He needed the title more than he needed the power. He needed the gathering at Apalachin more than he needed the invisibility that had protected organized crime for generations. The need for validation destroyed him. The meeting that was supposed to crown Vito Genovese as boss of bosses lasted less than an hour before state police arrived, and the coronation he had spent 30 years building toward became the beginning of an end he spent 10 years dying through, which makes November 14th, 1957, in a rural town in upstate New York, the exact moment when the most tactically brilliant plan in organized crime history became its most complete strategic failure.